In this lesson, we'll look at working with the cook selection and how we reselect components for an operation directly from the viewport. In the last lesson, as I performed this series of edge extrusions, you may have noticed that I didn't have to make a component selection at all. I was using what's known as the cook selection, and this is a component selection which is automatically output by an operator when we add it from the viewport. If I select and display this edit node, we can see the edge selection that I manually made in the viewport to apply the first edge extrusion to. If I select and display the first poly extrude node, and I'll just hover over the viewport and hit the escape key to switch from the handle tool to the view tool, we can see that it's the front newly extruded edges which are selected. As I step through each of these extrude operations, we can see that it's always the front extruded edges which are selected. This is how most other 3D applications work. If we were to perform these same extrude operations in another 3D app, the front extruded edges would typically be selected once we completed the edge extrusion, and we wouldn't have to reselect them to extrude them again or to perform a different operation on them. It's the most logical and useful way for the tool to work. Of course, what's different about Houdini is that as we work in the viewport, we're building this network of nodes at the same time, and this allows us to be able to step back through these operations like an undo history. In Houdini, this automatically generated selection is what's known as the cook selection, and there are a few useful things to know about working with cook selections. One is that we can always easily and quickly revert back to the cook selection using the Shift+R hotkey. So for example, with this last poly extrude node, we can see that the cook selection is these front extruded edges. Now if I start selecting, say, this ring of edges here to perform a different operation, and then realise that I want to go back and edit the previous edge selection, I can just tap Shift plus the R key to revert to that cook selection. When we revert to the cook selection, the resulting component selection depends on the current selection type. I'm currently in edge selection mode, and so when I reverted to the cook selection, it was the front extruded edges which became selected. If I switch to point selection mode by tapping the 2 key, and now tap Shift and the R key to revert to the cook selection, we see that it's now the points on those edges which are selected. If I tap the 4 key for primitive selection, and now tap Shift R, we see that all the primitives which are attached to those extruded edges are now selected. A node only outputs a cook selection when we add it from the viewport. For example, if I add another poly extrude node after this poly fill node, and I'll do this by hovering my cursor over the network editor and bringing up the tab menu, I'll search for the poly extrude node, and now a shortcut I can use here is to hold down Shift as I hit enter, and that automatically connects the new node to the end of the network. Now I'll enter the geometry selection mode by clicking on the arrow button at the end of the group parameter, and I'll select a partial loop of primitives by selecting one and then holding down the A key and left clicking on the second primitive. I'll hit enter to accept that selection, and I'll use the extrude handle to extrude these primitives. Now if I select a different primitive on the vase, now hit Shift R to revert to the cook selection, we see that nothing gets selected. You probably expect for these front extruded polygons to get selected by reverting to the cook selection, but I don't have a cook selection on this node because I added it from the network editor. This isn't a problem at all because, as I talked about a couple of lessons ago, interactive direct modeling workflows are different to procedural workflows. The poly extrude node, like many other operators, can output a whole range of different component selections as groups, and it's these groups which we'd use for further operations within a procedural network. So the cook selection is only something that we work with when we're working interactively in the viewport. It's only generated when we add an operator from the viewport, and it's the selection which we're most likely to use for the next operation in a direct modeling workflow. I'll delete this poly extrude node, and we'll finish off modeling this vase. I'll enable viewport subdivision for this geometry container by tapping Shift plus the E equals key while hovering over my viewport, and now I can see the remaining few edits I need to make to better match the reference model. I want to sharpen up this transition between the body of the vase and the base, so I'll hit the W key to switch to wireframe mode, and I'll tap the 3 key for edge selection, and I'll double click on this edge to select the whole loop. I'll tap the W key again to switch back to smooth shaded mode, and now I'll tap the C key to bring up the radial menu, and I'll swipe through to polygons and then up to poly bevel. Now I can just click and drag on the edge loop to increase the bevel offset distance, and I can use the scroll wheel to increase the divisions to 2. Now finally I want to give the vase some thickness, which I can do using the poly extrude node. I want to apply the extrusion to all the primitives, so I'll tap the 4 key to switch to primitive selection, and then the N key to select all, and now I'll tap the C key to bring up the radial menu and swipe through to the poly extrude node. Now I can use the extrude handle to extrude all the polygons inwards. By default, the extrude node only outputs the front and side primitives, so I'll enable the output of the back primitives to maintain the original surface that we're working with. We see that because I've extruded the primitives by a negative distance, they've been reversed. So I'll bring up the tab menu while hovering my cursor over the viewport, and I'll select the reverse node. Now we see that we've only reversed the inside faces, and that's because Houdini's used the Cuck selection. The Poly Extrude node automatically selects the front extruded components, and so it's the selection which is being used for the reverse node. To reselect the components for an operation while still working in the viewport, we can just tap the backtick key, and this does exactly the same thing as clicking on this white arrow at the end of the group parameter field. It puts us into the geometry selection mode. So now I can tap the N key while hovering over the viewport to select all primitives and hit enter. And now we see that we've reversed all the primitives. Of course, we could continue tweaking this model to get it closer to the reference, but we'll call this close enough. The point of this exercise has been to see how we apply our operations to viewport selections. So in this lesson, we've seen how we work with and revert to the Cuck selection, and how we can reselect components for a procedural operation directly from the viewport.